Imagine you re-hiking high in the mountains on what is supposed to be a normal day. The air is thin, the wind is sharp, and patches of old ice cling stubbornly to the rock even in late summer. You and your friend leave the main trail to get a better view of the glacier, stepping over loose stones and shallow meltwater streams. Then just ahead of you, something breaks the smooth white surface, not rock, not ice, but something that looks disturbingly like a human shoulder. At first you assume it's a tragic reminder of a recent climbing accident. People disappear in these mountains all the time. You move closer. The rock sticking out of the ice has skin, leathery and dark like old wood left out in the sun. There is a tangle of something that might be hair. A hand is frozen in the ice a few inches away, the fingers curled. There's no modern jacket, no bright-colored climbing rope, no helmet. Whoever this person is, they aren't dressed like the hikers you see on the trail. They're wrapped in what looks like thick, rough hide. That's when a very simple realization hits you. This isn't new. It's ancient. There's a moment where time seems to split. One part of your brain is still the weekend hiker thinking we should call for help. The other part feels something colder than the wind creep into your stomach. How long has this body been here? How many storms tore across this ridge while he lay locked in the ice? You look around and suddenly the landscape feels different. The rocks, the glacier, the cloud shadows moving over the peaks, they were all here when this person took his last breath. The hikers who made that discovery in the early 1990s were not archaeologists. They had no idea that they had just stumbled on one of the most important finds in modern history. To them, it was a body in the ice, shocking, upsetting, and a little unreal. But when they alerted local authorities, the story started to change. At first, rescuers assumed the same thing the hikers did. A lost mountaineer from the last few decades, finally pushed to the surface by a shrinking glacier. As they hacked the body free from the ice and examined it more closely, the timeline stopped making sense. The clothing was made from stitched animal hides, layered like primitive technical gear. The shoes were stuffed with grass for insulation. Next to the body lay a long bow, unfinished arrows, and a small, elegant axe with a bright metal head that had no business being that old. There were no plastic buckles, no modern fabric, no trace of any brand, tag, or logo. Instead, there were tools and materials that looked like they belonged in a museum display, not in the hands of someone who had died last winter. The rescue workers found themselves doing something strange, treating a mountain recovery as a crime scene, but also as an excavation. They had to document the position of every strap, every tool, every scrap of leather, knowing that once the ice melted, they would never see it quite the same way again. Camera flashes lit up a body that had last seen sunlight when humans still used stone blades as their main cutting tools. Even the simple act of lifting him out of his frozen cradle felt like pulling a page out of a sealed book. Experts were called in. The body was moved to a lab, still frozen, like a time capsule. When radiocarbon dating results came back, they didn't push the story back a few decades, or even a few centuries. They pushed it back more than 5,000 years. The man in the ice had died before the pyramids of Egypt were built, before writing had taken hold in most of the world, before many of the civilizations we take for granted in history books even existed. He was older than almost every monument people travel across continents to see. Overnight, a random discovery by two hikers became a case the entire scientific world was watching. Newspapers called him the Iceman of the Alps. Museums and governments began to argue over who owned him. Was he a person, a specimen, a national treasure, or something else entirely? For anthropologists, he was a one-in-a-million opportunity. For forensic experts, he was the coldest cold case they had ever seen. And for anyone who had ever looked at a mountain glacier and wondered what secrets were locked inside, he was a chilling answer. What made this discovery so powerful wasn't just the age of the body. It was the condition he was in. This wasn't a pile of bones or a handful of stone tools buried in the ground. This was a human being preserved with his skin, his hair, his clothes, his last meal still in his stomach. It was as if someone had taken a man from the late Stone Age, pressed pause on his body at the moment of death, and hidden him in the ice until modern science was ready to meet him. And as researchers soon realized, that meeting was going to change a lot more than just one page in a textbook. Once the shock of the date sank in, the real work began. Archaeologists, biologists, forensic pathologists, and historians all wanted a piece of the puzzle. Every thread in his clothing, every tool, every hair on his head was suddenly important. This wasn't just about one life and one death. It was a fully equipped time traveler from a world we only knew in fragments. If they could read the clues properly, they could reconstruct not only how this man died, but how he lived, and what his world really looked like. They started with his clothing. It turned out that the primitive layers he wore were anything but crude. He had a fur-lined coat, leggings, a belt, and a kind of backpack frame. Each piece was made from different animal skins chosen for different reasons: warmth, flexibility, strength. The stitching was surprisingly precise. There were seams reinforced where the fabric would rub and wear out. He wore shoes that were essentially ancient hiking boots. Leather shells packed with dried grass for insulation, held together by a clever system of cords. Far from being a half-dressed wanderer who got caught in bad weather, this man had come prepared for the mountains. Researchers laid out his gear on clean tables and realized they were looking at something like a complete survival kit. A small pouch held fire-starting materials. Another carried dried fungus that may have been used for medicine or as kindling. There were bits of cord, bone tools, and small wooden pieces whose exact purpose they still argue about today. To anyone who has ever packed a backpack for a long trek, choosing what to carry, what to leave, the logic felt familiar. He knew this landscape, and he knew that once you were above the tree line, you survived with whatever you brought. Then came the tools. The long bow found near his body was unfinished, but it told experts that he was not just a casual traveler. He was a hunter, someone who knew how to work wood and shape it for power and accuracy. The arrows, some already fletched and ready, were stored in a well-made quiver. He carried a flint knife, a scraper, and small tools designed to repair leather or cut wood. But the object that really made archaeologists sit up straight was the axe. Its head was made of copper, not stone. Up until then, many researchers believed that people living in that region at that time were still mostly using stone tools. Metalworking was supposed to be a later development, slowly moving into the mountains from more advanced regions. But this man carried a beautifully crafted copper axe, its blade carefully shaped and polished, mounted on a skillfully carved wooden handle. It meant that 5,000 years ago, high in these remote valleys, someone was already mining and smelting metal. That single tool quietly rewrote the timeline of technology in the region. Metallurgists analyzed tiny samples from the axe and traced the copper back to specific ore sources. It became clear that there were trade networks, or at least regular movement between different valleys and regions. The man in the ice was not living in an isolated little world. He was part of a web of exchange where knowledge, materials, and skills moved across mountains long before any road or written record. Next, they looked at the body itself. Modern imaging allowed researchers to scan him without destroying anything. They saw healed fractures that told them he'd lived through previous injuries. They found more than 60 tattoos on his skin, not decorative patterns on his face or hands, but small dark lines clustered around joints and along his spine. When they compared the locations to common pain points and acupuncture lines, a theory emerged. These tattoos might have been part of an early form of pain treatment, like a mix of medicine and ritual. If that was true, it meant that people in his world understood chronic pain, experimented with ways to relieve it, and maybe even had a kind of proto-medical practice. They studied his teeth for clues to his childhood. Chemical signatures in the enamel suggested that he had grown up in one valley and spent adulthood in another. In other words, he had moved at least once in his life, crossing distance and borders we had once imagined were barely populated. That movement hinted at something we often underestimate. People in the deep past did not just sit in one place and wait for civilization to arrive. They traveled, migrated, and changed homes, just like we do. Then came one of the most unsettling discoveries. For years, everyone assumed that this man had simply gotten caught in a storm and frozen to death. It would have been sad, but not surprising. The mountains are unforgiving. But when researchers studied the images of his body more closely, they spotted something hidden deep in his shoulder, the unmistakable outline of a stone arrowhead. It hadn't come from a hunting accident. It had gone in from behind, at an angle that suggested he was running or turning away when he was hit. In other words, the Iceman hadn't just been a victim of bad weather. He had been attacked. Once they knew there was an arrowhead in his shoulder, investigators went back over every inch of evidence with fresh eyes. Suddenly, the entire scene up on that ridge looked less like a tragic accident and more like the aftermath of a crime. A blood trail on his clothing, bruising on his head, defensive wounds on his hands. They all started to fit together into a much darker story. The ancient mountains hadn't just preserved his body. They had preserved the final minutes of a violent confrontation. The angle of the projectile suggested that the shot came from a distance, probably from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The arrow had cut through a major artery. Even if he had been surrounded by healers, there was almost nothing they could have done. In modern terms, he would have bled out within minutes. But up on a cold mountain pass, far from any settlement, he had no chance at all. He may have tried to keep moving, to get over the ridge or back down the slope, but at some point, his strength ran out and he collapsed. The ice did the rest. Why was he up there in the first place? That question became one of the biggest debates around the case. Some researchers suggested that he was a trader, carrying goods along a route between valleys. Others believed he was fleeing from his own community, an exile or a rival who had lost a power struggle. Still others thought he might have been a leader or a specialist, a hunter, a shaman or a craftsman whose death was the result of some unresolved conflict. The tools he carried, and the care taken with his clothing, suggested that he wasn't at the bottom of his society. Someone had invested time, resources, and knowledge into preparing him for life in rough terrain. Inside his stomach, scientists found another set of clues. Advanced analysis let them reconstruct his last meals. He hadn't been starving. In fact, he had eaten relatively recently before he died. Meat, grains, herbs, and fat, all cooked and prepared. This wasn't a man desperately scavenging for survival. He had access to food, to people who knew how to cook, to a settled life somewhere below the snowline. His teeth told the story of a childhood spent on a different type of soil than the one where he died, hinting at movement across regions, trade routes, or even migration. Some researchers zoomed out even further, asking, what was happening in this region around the time he died? Pollen, trapped in the ice, and in the lining of his clothing suggested a changing landscape. Forests being cleared, fields being planted, herds moving through high meadows. It was a world in transition, where older ways of living were colliding with newer ones. In such times, tensions often rise, over land, over water, over control. The arrow in his back began to look less like random violence and more like a symptom of something larger. Bit by bit, a picture emerged of a connected, complex world that many textbooks had treated as simple. These people farmed, herded animals, moved between regions, worked metal, developed medical practices, and carried out long journeys through dangerous terrain. They had conflicts serious enough to end in murder. They had identities, loyalties, and enemies. And until this frozen stranger appeared on the news, most of that had been flattened into a few paragraphs about early European farmers. For forensic scientists, the case was eerie because it felt so familiar. They were using the same tools they would use to reconstruct a modern crime. Trajectory analysis, wound patterns, chemical testing, scene reconstruction. The only difference was the date. It was as if a homicide detective had been handed a file and then told, by the way, your victim has been dead for 5,000 years. The methods still worked. The motives in many ways sounded painfully timeless. The more they studied him, the more it became clear that this discovery wasn't just filling in a gap. It was exposing the limitations of the story we had been telling about the deep past. Whole cultures had risen and fallen in places where we'd assumed very little was happening. Techniques that we thought were invented later had clearly been tested much earlier. And all of it had been locked away in a shrinking field of mountain ice, waiting for one hot summer and two curious hikers to bring it back into the light. As the scientific story unfolded, another more human story began to grow around the Iceman. News outlets ran dramatic headlines about the world's oldest murder mystery. Documentaries showed slow, haunting shots of the glacier where he was found. Museums built entire exhibits around him. Visitors would press their faces to the glass, looking at the shriveled but recognizable features of a man who had died before almost all recorded history, and still think he looks like us. With that attention came controversy. 2 countries claimed ownership because he had been found near a modern border, and the exact line on the map in that icy, shifting landscape was suddenly worth arguing over. Local communities began to see him as part of their heritage, a symbol of how long people had lived in those mountains. Lawsuits were filed over who had the right to display him, study him, or profit from his image. In life, he might have been a hunter, a farmer, or a wanderer. In death, he had become evidence, property, and a tourist attraction. Inside the museum that eventually housed him, entire teams debated how to show his body to the public. Should they recreate the mountain landscape in a darkened room to remind visitors that he had once lain under open sky? Should they hide him from direct view and only show scans and reconstructions out of respect? In the end, they built a kind of high-tech tomb. A climate-controlled chamber keeping his body at temperatures similar to the glacier, with a small window through which visitors could look. It was half laboratory, half shrine. Then came the rumors of a curse. Over the years, a series of people connected to the discovery, a guide, a researcher, a journalist, a politician, died unexpectedly. Accidents, illnesses, sudden tragedies. Statistically, it wasn't unusual, but that's not how people think. It didn't take long for the pattern-hungry human brain to do what it always does. Whispers started. The Iceman was angry, disturbed, punishing those who had cut him out of his frozen grave. Never mind that he had already spent thousands of years in the dark, that his body would have eventually slid out of the melting glacier anyway. The idea was too compelling to ignore. Of course, scientists rejected the curse explanation, but even they couldn't ignore the emotional weight of what they were doing. This wasn't a pottery shard or a broken spear. This was a human being with a face, hands, and a wound in his back. When they carried out studies, they were cutting into someone's skin, scanning someone's brain, examining someone's organs. At more than one point, team members reported that they felt like they were standing halfway between a hospital and a tomb. They were doing autopsies on a man whose family had died thousands of years before, but whose body still demanded a kind of respect. Ethical questions started to surface. How much testing was too much? Was it acceptable to keep his body on display indefinitely? Or should he be buried again under ritual of some kind? Who gets to decide what is for science and what is just morbid curiosity? Some argued that the information gained about ancient disease, diet, migration, and technology justified almost any level of study. Others felt that there had to be a line, even if the person in question had been dead for millennia. Meanwhile, the ice itself was disappearing. Around the world, glaciers shrank year after year. On other mountains, other remains had begun to appear. Lost climbers from the 20th century, soldiers from forgotten battles, drowned forests, and ancient paths. Archaeologists even have a name for the work that follows: ice patch archaeology, a race against time to gather whatever the melting ice releases before sun and rain destroy it. Each new discovery felt like a message from both the past and the future. The Iceman had been locked away by a cold climate that preserved him. Now, a warming world was giving him back. If one body could change our understanding of prehistory so dramatically, what else was still hidden out there, waiting for the ice to let go? In the end, the story of the Iceman is not just about one unlucky traveler who died on a mountain pass. It's about how fragile our version of history really is. For centuries, scholars wrote long, confident narratives about where civilization began, how technology spread, and when humans learned certain skills. They filled in gaps with best guesses and tidy diagrams. Then a body slid out of a melting glacier, and a large part of that neat picture had to be erased and drawn again. This one discovery forced timelines to shift and theories to be rewritten. It showed that the people we once dismissed as simple early farmers were capable of complex technology, long-distance journeys, and advanced medical practices. It reminded us that what we call ancient history was lived one day at a time by individuals who woke up worried, hopeful, tired, and hungry. just like we do. When you look at his worn shoes and patched clothing, you're not seeing a symbol. You're seeing someone who spent a morning getting dressed, who tied knots with fingers that ached from cold. And he is not alone. Around the world, other discoveries have done the same thing in different ways. In Turkey, a hill once thought to be natural turned out to hide massive stone circles thousands of years older than Stonehenge. In the Middle East, jars in caves sheltered fragile scrolls that forced historians to rethink what they knew about early religious communities. On the ocean floor, shipwrecks hold cargoes that map out forgotten trade routes. Each time the pattern repeats. We tell ourselves a story about the past, we get comfortable with it, and then the ground shifts. Sometimes it's a farmer's plow striking stone. Sometimes it's a construction crew uncovering a burial. Sometimes it's a hiker kicking loose a piece of ice on a steep slope. And suddenly, our idea of what humans were capable of at a given moment in time has to expand. The discovery that rewrote ancient history isn't a single moment. It's a recurring event, a reminder that the past is not a finished book, but a draft covered in corrections we haven't read yet. Maybe the most unsettling part is this. If one frozen man can rewrite that much, how much are we still missing? How many entire cultures left nothing behind that we can easily recognize? How many inventions were tried, perfected, and lost before being reinvented thousands of years later? How many lives, just as rich and complicated as ours, ended without a glacier to hold them in place for future scientists to examine? When you strip away the mystery, the curse stories, and the legal fights, what remains is something quietly profound. A man walked into the mountains 5,000 years ago and did not come back. The people who knew him mourned or moved on. Generations passed, entire civilizations rose and fell. Languages appeared, changed, and vanished. Maps were drawn and redrawn. The trail he took disappeared under snow and ice. And yet, because of the way he died and the place he fell, he ended up speaking more loudly to the future than almost anyone he ever met in life. Standing in front of his glass case, or looking at a photograph of his face, you are confronted with a simple truth. We are the ancient people of someone else's future. One day, long after our cities have crumbled and our devices have turned to dust, a handful of objects might survive. A tool, a fragment of clothing, a body in an unexpected place. Someone will dig it up, scan it, measure it, and tell a story about us. They'll draw conclusions about what we valued, how we lived, and what we feared. The discovery that rewrote ancient history is a reminder that those stories are always provisional. They're the best we can do with what we have right now. But somewhere, locked in ice, buried under soil, or resting on the bottom of a forgotten lake, there are more corrections waiting, more surprises, more individuals from the deep past, frozen on the last day of their life, carrying evidence we don't yet know how to interpret. The only real constant in the story of history is that it keeps changing the moment we think we finally understand it.